And welcome back to another Econ Podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this Econ Podcast, we're going to talk about connecting a couple concepts together for the monopolist, and those are elasticity, the demand curve, marginal revenue, total revenue, and revenue maximization. We're going to connect those concepts together. To do so, I'm going to start with looking at a hypothetical demand curve. So here's a hypothetical demand curve right here. Here's a demand schedule with different prices and quantities. So I'm saying that when the price is $1, consumers will buy 8 units of the good. When the price is $2, they'll buy 7 units of the good. When the price is $3, they'll buy 6 units of the good, and so on, going the rest of the way down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by graphing those. So let me just back up and get rid of some of that. So what I'm going to start by doing is just graphing that demand information. So I'm going to graph the demand curve. So when the price was $1, consumers were willing to buy 8 units of the good. $2, they were willing to buy 7 units of the good. Sorry about that. 3 and 6, and just go through and graph the rest of these. So I'm just graphing this information right here. I'm just graphing that demand schedule. So I connect the dots, and I have a demand curve. So there's our demand curve for whatever this good is. Doesn't matter what the good is. Okay, and let me just redraw that. Just try to get that a little straighter through all these dots. I just missed it again. There we go. So there's my demand curve. And then what we're going to say is that we're going to calculate the revenue and the marginal revenue. So the revenue I've been talking about on some other videos for monopoly, and that is revenue is calculated just by taking the price times the quantity. So if the price is $1 and the consumers buy 8 units of the good, it'd be 1 times 8 is going to be your revenue. It's just going to be 8. 2 times 7, if we charge $2, consumers will buy 7 units of the good. 7 times 2 is 14, and so on. So those are your revenue numbers, and I'm going to take these revenue numbers. That's all right here. They're all just the price times the quantities at different points on the demand curve, and I'm going to graph that down below. So okay, so let's get rid of that, and let's graph the revenue numbers. So the revenue numbers were when the quantity was 1. Here, I should have these quantities marked down here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So when the quantity was 1, the revenue was $8. When the price was 2, the revenue was $14. When the price was 3, when I just said that wrong. When the quantity was 1, the revenue was $8. When the quantity was 2, when we produced 2 units, the revenue was $14. At 3, it would be the revenue would be 18. So I'm just these numbers up here. When the quantity is 4, the revenue was 20. Quantity was 5, the revenue was 20. And then back down here on the other side. So, and then we connect these dots, and that's going to be our revenue curve. Okay, and you can see me do that. It's going to be our revenue curve. And you can see me do this go into more detail on all this on one of my podcasts, in one of my videos in the elasticity playlist, if you want to get into this a little bit more. So here I have the demand curve. Here I have the revenue curve. And now I'm going to add something to this graph, which is the marginal revenue curve. I'm going to add the marginal revenue curve. So what's the marginal revenue? The marginal revenue, remember, is just the change in the total revenue divided by the change in the quantity. Change in revenue divided by change in quantity. So this is the revenue, and the marginal revenue is the change in this revenue divided by the change in the output. And the change in the output is equal to 1 each time. We go from producing 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and so forth. So the marginal revenue for the first one would be 8. For the second one, for the second unit that we produced, the marginal revenue would be 6. Where did I get that 6? Well, my total revenue went from 8 to 14 when I increased production from 1 to 2. So my marginal revenue on that was 6. Okay, and then my marginal revenue for the next unit was 4, going from 14 to 18. Marginal revenue on the next one was 2, going from 18 to 20, and so on. So I'm going to graph that marginal revenue over here. So the marginal revenue, the first one, when the quantity was 1, the marginal revenue was 8. That was right there. And then for the second one, it was 6. And for the third one, it was 4. For the fourth one, the marginal revenue, let's see, for the fourth one, okay, right here, the marginal revenue was 2. So the marginal revenue was 2. For the fifth one, the marginal revenue was 0. That would be down here. And then after that, it goes negative, okay? So this is my marginal revenue curve. Now, this builds off of an idea that I've been talking about that I talked about on some previous podcasts in this playlist, and that is in the Monopoly playlist, and that is for a monopolist, the demand curve is going to separate from the marginal revenue curve. They're going to separate from each other. Now, that separation is going to become super important because, and you can watch my video, as I said before, where I talk about this in my elasticity playlist. But what I did was I calculated midpoint elasticity. If you don't remember how to calculate that, you can go back and watch that, watch the video where I do it in the elasticity playlist. But for the purposes of this video, I'm assuming that you know what midpoint elasticity is. The midpoint elasticity from prices 1 to prices 2, the midpoint elasticity is 0.2. Okay, so that would be from prices 1 to prices 2. That's right here. The elasticity would be equal to 0.2. The elasticity from price 7 to price 8 has an elasticity of 5. Okay, so that's up here. From 7 to 8, the elasticity is equal to, sorry, not 0.5, but just 5 is the elasticity. And then the elasticity from prices 4 to prices 5, that's right here in the middle. Okay, this elasticity right here in the middle would be equal to 1. Now, here's the connection that I want to make through all this. The connection that I want to make is this connection between revenue maximization, elasticity, and marginal revenue equals 0. Okay, so there's going to be an important connection to be made between those three concepts. And here comes the important idea. So here's what we see. When the marginal revenue is equal to 0, that's what I say right here. When the marginal revenue is equal to 0, where's that happen? That happens right here. That happens right here. When the marginal revenue is equal to 0, watch what happens. When the marginal revenue is equal to 0, okay, when the marginal revenue is equal to 0, that is when we are at the point of unit elasticity. Okay, and technically, because I'm not using calculus here, so I'm not calculating elasticity at every single point. Technically, it's when we go from this point to this point. In between those 2 points, the elasticity is equal to 1. That's called unit elastic. Now, here's what we know about unit elastic. Unit elastic happens to be the point of revenue maximization. That's what I actually showed on that previous video back in my elasticity playlist. We looked at that time, if you go back and watch that video, we showed that when, and I'm showing it to you now, when the elasticity is equal to 1, when that happens, we're going to be at the point of revenue maximization. Okay, that's right here. That means that if we choose to set production, if the monopolist chooses to produce between 4 and 5 units, those 4 or 5 units will be the point where we maximize revenue, okay? And that's when, in this case, the price is actually between 4 and 5, okay? And so when we're at that point of unit elastic, that also happens to be the point where marginal revenue is equal to 0. And that makes sense that marginal revenue would equal 0, because when marginal revenue equals 0, that is giving me the point of revenue maximization. Okay, so those numbers are all getting, these graphs are getting kind of sloppy. Let's come over here to the general concept. Okay, so here it is over here. When we are at the point, here's the thing that has to be true all the time, okay? When we are at this point right here, that point will be the point of unit elastic. When the elasticity is equal to 1 on the demand curve, I showed over here, okay? I showed over here on this graph that has to be the point at which marginal revenue is equal to 0. Those two things have to happen together. Mathematically, they have to happen together. But here's what else we know. We know that the marginal revenue is really just the slope of this total revenue curve down here. So when the marginal revenue is equal to 0, that is when we are at the maximum point for total revenue. That's when total revenue is maximized. So we know that these three concepts, okay, maximizing total revenue, marginal revenue equals 0, and elasticity equals 1, those three things always have to go together. They always have to be true at the same time. When elasticity equals 1, marginal revenue will equal 0, and total revenue will be maximized at that point. Those three concepts always have to connect together. That's the big idea here, that is connecting together the demand curve, the idea of elasticity, the idea of revenue maximization, and the idea of marginal revenue being equal to 0. Okay, so those are the big concepts. So let's just finish by reading this statement up here. When marginal revenue is equal to 0, the slope of total revenue is equal to 0, because the slope of the total revenue is called marginal revenue, and that will be the point of revenue maximization. Note that this is also the point of unit elasticity on the demand curve. Okay, that's those three concepts all connecting together. And that's important, and it has to always be true. Elasticity equals 1, marginal revenue equals 0, maximizing total revenue. All right, this has been Mr. Hagen on another Econ podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.